Dan Breezeboy here answering your seedy questions. So, Katie wrote in and asked, is it true that you should freeze bean seeds for a few days to kill weevils before storing long term? So the answer is usually yes. There are things called bean weevils which lay their eggs on, or I guess inside the egg, and during the winter they'll hatch and bore out of the egg, leaving little holes in your beans and little weevils in your bean packages. And this can be gross. This can freak you out a little bit. It can also affect the germination rate of the beans, though it's surprising how well beans can still germinate even if they have had bean weevils. Nonetheless, it's not a great thing for the seed quality. Also, so if your beans are stored in a glass jar like this, then the bean weevils will be restricted in the jar. But if you're storing in plastic or in paper bags, your bean weevils can go through that into your next bean lot if they're stored with other beans. So if you have one contaminated bean lot, it can contaminate other beans. Now, depending where you are, I mean, where we are outside of Montreal in Quebec, we don't consistently get bean weevils. We get them occasionally. And if you're in a climate like us, you might save seed for a while and not see any bean weevils. And then you'll see it for the first time and you won't be thrilled with it. Now, so I find one time is one time too many. So freezing bean seeds is a good way to get rid of bean weevils. Now you can. So what I've read from anywhere between 2 days and 3 weeks of freezing, and there probably is an actual specific answer. What I do is we freeze for 1 week. And we have a dedicated chest freezer on our farm that we use to freeze all our bean seeds in the fall. We actually also freeze pea seeds. We freeze sunflower seeds. Do we freeze corn? I'm not sure if we freeze corn, but we freeze the other three for sure. And we freeze those systematically to avoid pests. If you have a smaller quantity of beans, you could put them in your fridge freezer or just in your home chest freezer, and that's fine. If you also live somewhere where you have some pretty intense colds in the autumn, you can freeze them outdoors. So some falls, and this is not true across the board, but some falls will have temperatures down to -10, -15 degrees Celsius in November. And if we have that kind of temperature, we will put a pallet outside in an outbuilding. We'll put our beans in bins out there and make sure they're weatherproof, but put them out there and let them freeze for a week or so outside. And we love that because you can do a large batch in a short amount of time. But it's not consistent. It's not reliably freezing cold like that in November for us. So we will. So we have that dedicated chest freezer. Now, with the chest freezer, when you're taking beans or any seeds out of the freezer, you're going to want to let them sit for a day or so to come back to room temperature to avoid condensation when you're opening the package. Now, one other thing about freezing seeds, if you have bean seeds, you got to make sure they're really dry before you freeze them. And one way to tell if they're dry is you can take that bean and you can bite it. And look at beans in my mouth. If it cracks, well, I can't really see this, but if it cracks, then you know the seed is dry enough. If it smushes, then the seed is not dry enough and it might get damaged by freezing. So you want to make sure your seed is dry enough before you freeze it. And that kind of brings us to the second part of the question, which is, how long can I store beans in their pods before processing them and cleaning them? Well, you can store beans quite a while because you want to get them to be quite dry. So I wouldn't worry about storing into the early winter. Now, the longer you store, the more chance there is of weevils. But you can freeze beans in their pods, either in a freezer. Now, it takes a lot more volume if the beans are still in the pods, depending how many you have, or by putting them in bins outside if it's pretty cold. So you could probably, I would feel comfortable keeping beans, not worrying about weevils until probably November, December, assuming they're harvested kind of around September. I'd be able to go further. And if you can freeze the beans in the pods, you can hold them indefinitely. And then the last part of the question is, could I harvest bean pods in the fall, but then store them for a month or two until I have more time in the winter to shell and process them? Yes, you can. So, thanks, Katie, for sharing your question with me. And if any of you have any seed questions, there's a link down below where you can click and send them to me. And I look forward to answering them in the future. Thanks for watching. I guess subscribe and all that stuff, and go out and grow some seed.